Welcome back. I hope you've downloaded the Unit 7 notes on Shobi. The title is Hybridization. It's in Chapter 9 of our chemistry textbook. We have to do a little bit of background review before we jump into this topic. We need to review what valence electrons and valence orbitals are. So here we see just a reminder that the s orbital is the orbital that has a spherical shape. It's followed by a p orbital, which actually has three suborbitals. And remember, the p orbital has kind of a peanut shape or a dumbbell shape, if you will. And it has three suborbitals, one on an x-axis, one on a y-axis, and one on a z-axis. We also would be wise to try to recall how to write electron configurations. So I've done that over here on the side. I wrote an electron configuration for carbon, kind of as a reminder. Remember, carbon has a 1s2, 2s2, 2p2 configuration. What does that mean again? That the first s orbital has two electrons in it, the second s orbital has two electrons, and then the second energy level p orbital has two electrons as well for carbon. We also should remember how to read orbital diagrams. So here is the orbital diagram for carbon. We just show that the first s orbital has those two electrons, right? Spinning in opposite directions because they do repel each other. And that the second energy level's s orbital has two electrons. And the second energy level's p orbital has two electrons as well. Remember that the electrons are added one orbital, one suborbital at a time before they are doubled. The last thing we need to remember is, what does valence mean? So valence means outermost. That refers to the electrons that are in the outermost region, the highest energy level. Those are the electrons involved in bonding. So those are the ones we care about the most, right? And for carbon, those would be the electrons at the second energy level, right? Not the first energy level. These are sort of the ground state electrons. They have the lowest energy level in the atom. We're talking about the valence electrons. And any atom's valence electrons are the electrons that are at the highest energy level. For carbon, that energy level is 2, right? But for something in the third period of the periodic chart, that energy level would be 3s and or 3p, however many are in the third. And anything that has a 4s and or a 4p, we would add those together, and that would be the valence number. So that's just a little background information. Next, we need to consider the shape of this molecule methane, CH4. Take a look on the right. It's got a familiar tetrahedral shape, right? And the question that this chapter starts out with is how? How could these native orbitals lead to this tetrahedral structure? That doesn't seem right. How can a circular, spherical orbital, excuse me, and three p-shaped orbitals come together to make something that has a tetrahedral shape? I mean, if you drew that, it doesn't seem like it would add up. Here are the two problems and reasons why we know that something more must be happening. Number one, the carbon atom in methane has native p orbitals that are 90 degrees apart. What do I mean by that? If we drew those p orbitals, right? Remember, there's one on the x-axis, one on the y-axis, even one on the z-axis. Each one of those is 90 degrees apart. This does not match the observed 109.5 bond angles in the tetrahedral molecule, right? Take a look at this tetrahedral. So this is the shape we know CH4 has based on the VSEPR theory, and these bond angles are larger. So the first thing we know is, when carbon forms this bond in CH4, or these four bonds rather, it can't just have those typical orbitals, those native orbitals that we're accustomed to. Something's happening. Secondly, The interaction of hydrogen with carbon's native valence orbitals would show different bonding, whether an s or a p orbital were involved. But the bonds in the methane molecule are identical. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look here. We have a carbon atom in the center, 4 hydrogen atoms surrounding it. Now, each hydrogen only has 1 electron, right? So here's an s orbital. It can only fill an s orbital. And we have another s and another s. Now, when the bonds form, one of those hydrogen s's will be overlapping with the s in the carbon, right? And then another hydrogen will be overlapping with the piece of y specifically, and then another will be overlapping with the piece of x, and then the piece of z. All those bonds would be different, which we know isn't the case. So the second part says, but the bonds in methane are all identical. So these two problems led chemist Linus Pauling to investigate and to come up with this theory called hybridization. We conclude that native atomic orbitals are changed when they participate in bonding. So atoms' orbitals actually change when they participate in bonding. This change is referred to as hybridization. That means the blending of native atomic orbitals to form bonding orbitals. So orbitals are different when atoms have formed a bond. And that's true within each bonding atom, right? Take a look at this molecule here. It's made of 1 atom of carbon. That carbon has formed new orbitals in order to participate in these bonds. It's made of 4 atoms of fluorine. Each one of those fluorine atoms has developed new hybrid orbitals, not the ones that it had before. The hybridization happens to each atom.